My name is Carl Balestracci, and this is Unc DeRoss. He's called Unc, but officially he's Anthony. He's in charge of the weather every time we do this, so that's why we have such beautiful weather. I'm in charge of the porta potty, and I can assure you it works because I've already taken advantage of it. But anyway, we both share a common heritage, not just with this quarry, but in this stone. But as Uncle explained and show you pictures later, he worked here from the time he was 10, I think, with his dad and his grandparents. My grandfather, both grandfathers worked here. One from Milford, Mass., my mother's father, and then my father's father, who lived in Stony Creek. So we have that common heritage, and we've been talking about the quarries and hearing stories from our grandparents all our lives, and we've been doing some research recently of the different quarries, so it's very exciting. We recently have had a visitor from the museum at the Statue of Liberty who came to get a tour of the quarries, and I think today we have at least one geologist from Yale who said he was coming, but he's going to help us to identify the quarry site from which the stone of the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty actually came. But anyway, let's start first with the natural resource itself, the pink granite. When we did a book about the quarry workers and the quarries, what was it, 2001? 2001. It was to honor the quarry workers mostly, but the first chapter was written by Professor Jay Ague, head of geology at Yale University. Now, I had never taken a geology course in school, but I listened to at least a couple of his talks, and it was very, very interesting. And there's a lot of detail about the stone in the book, but very briefly, let me just say that when we talk about the histories of Branford or Guilford, we talk about the 1600s, and we're very proud that our towns are so old. But when we talk about pink granite, this natural resource that we enjoy, we're talking millions and millions of years. The Earth apparently, according to the geologists, is about 4.5 billion years old. And about 600 million years ago, there was just one large landmass surrounded by water. But through volcanic action and very high pressures in the core of the Earth, the continents began to separate and form. And in some cases, volcanoes did not erupt. They came slowly to the surface of the Earth. But those volcanoes that never reached the surface and never erupted and formed lava remained below the surface, cooled slowly over millions of years, and became igneous rock. These cooled cores of very hot stone, they were called magma. And this particular pink granite was one of those formed by magma that never erupted. When the continents split apart, and you can take a look at these, you can come up closer afterwards, but as they began to split apart and form, the magma of this one particular cooled volcano, or a magma, split apart into three pieces. One piece is on the west coast of South America. It's hard to picture this, but another piece is in the mountains of Morocco, and the third piece is between Guilford Point and Branford Harbor, and goes up north of I-95 to form all of this pink granite. Now, it's not all uniform. There's some sections in our towns where there's a lot of organic material in the stone. There's a small piece here. Again, you'll be able to come up and look at it closer, but there's an awful lot of black lines in this small specimen. This comes from down near the shore in Old Quarry. And then there's other pieces that are very pinkish with very little black in it. So there's different qualities of the pink granite, but this site is one of the very best. And I'm going to stop there for a minute and let Unc carry on, because he'll bring us up to the 1850s and beginning of some of these quarries.
Okay, Carl, thank you. Well, anyway, what I'd like to talk about is this quarry in particular, and and I'd also like to talk about some of the people, because when you talk about any major operation like this, it becomes the people become a major part of it. But we can start with right where you folks are standing right now was the beginning of the Norcross quarry. Prior to this quarry, Norcross had opened up a quarry just on the other side of this, just north of this, between here and the turnpike, and that was called Red Hill Quarry. That quarry was all right. It came out fairly good grade of stone. However, they opened up this particular ledge right here, and if you look later on, if you look at this picture right here, you'll see 3 marks coming down from this steam drill. This picture was taken around the 1870s when they used it for the advent of the steam drill. And if you look up on that quarry ledge up there, you see right at the very top, you'll see 3 lines coming down the quarry ledge. That was the beginning of the Stony Creek Quarry, and this was the holes right here. What they did is they drilled 3 holes down. That's about 1.25 to 2 inches in diameter with this steam drill. It was quite an arduous job. They start off with a 2-foot drill, then go to pull it out, put in a 4-foot drill, and kept going down until they could load it with black powder. And the reason they did 3 holes like that is so they can have a directional blast. At any rate, once they opened it up, they realized that this was a good quality stone, and that was the start of the Stony Creek Quarry. But before that, there was a lot of quarrying that went on in this area prior to the 1850s, and it was done mostly by the original settlers here were the English, naturally, and they used mostly field stone for their chimneys and markers and things like that, some of their walls. Then later on, in the earlier 1800s, was the biggest immigration at that time was the Germans. They came in and they started actually using the stone for decorative purposes. You would find them start cutting stone for a little more fancy markers and decorating their houses. But all that was done, for commercially anyway, was done along the coast. And the reason for that was they could not move this stone to market other than by boat. So you along the coast here in Stony Creek, some of the very first quarries were right on the very coast. In fact, the first one in Branford was on the end of West Point Road in Stony Creek. And they would ship it out by water. The advent of the railroad, 1850, was when everything opened up for the quarrymen or the quarry owners. Now they had access to the quarries and these ledges inland. And that's what now. They were able to not only get access to it, but they could also bring it to market, and that became the big deal. In our area, right here in Stony Creek, and as well as along virtually the entire coastline of Connecticut, if there was any one major event that changed the course of our communities, it was the railroad, of all of them. So the road that came through here was the New Haven, New London, Stonington Railroad, which is better known as the Shoreline Railroad. So what they were able to do then was to send a spur up here from the railroad and get their stone to market. The very first stone, if you folks are going back toward Guilford, as you go down around and leave the quarry road down here and make that sharp corner around and you have the meadows out there, you'll see pilings out in the meadows. Those pilings are there from the Red Hill Quarry. They still remain there, but the tracks went out across the marsh and connected with the high iron of the New Haven, New London Railroad. At the end, around 1906, the railroad was abandoned, and they went on to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which is presently where the tracks are now. The Norcross brothers, who owned this quarry, then opened up a new spur down, which you came up. That road that you came up through the marsh down here was actually the railroad right-of-way. Prior to that time, the only access to the quarry by cart or by car was up in the back. In other words, when you came in over there, you did not come across that marsh. You had to go around it until they built the railroad. So then they built this, the railroad went into Stony Creek directly. Norcross Brothers bought a section of the track from the New Haven Railroad and set up a siding in Stony Creek. They had 6 sidings in Stony Creek. It was a major, major operation for the purpose of distributing stone. Norcross Brothers were world-renowned because they were probably one of the very few contractors in the world that could go and bring out massive stone blocks. And one of the examples of that was the West Point Monument. If you ever been to West Point, the West Point Monument came out of a piece of stone right over here. It came right out over here, and one of these pictures shows right here. Right there is the West Point Monument block. That block, when it was sitting in the ledge over there, weighed 300 tons. When they brought it out and finished the project, it weighed 92 tons. When it was done and transported to the military academy up on West Point. I'll tell you a little bit about that, if you don't mind. That left here, and it took them 13 days to get it to New York. It left here, went down the New Haven, New London Railroad to Saybrook. From Saybrook, it went to Hartford. From Hartford, it went to Fishkill, New York. Went across the river, and then there was no railroad at West Point. So they had to build a railroad from the river up to West Point. Now that's a pretty good climb up there to the thing. When they went up there, they maneuvered it around through the academy, around the buildings, and brought the monument and set it up where it is today. And what's remarkable about that is it was done by 12 men from Stony Creek, the entire project. It took them 13 days to get from here to the Hudson River, but it took them 5 weeks to get up to the mountain. But once they got up there, they were able to erect the monument. And when it was all done, there was no cranes or anything else. They had to build this equipment that could stand up a 92-ton column, which, by the way, at the time, was the largest single polished stone column in the world at the time. The total cost of it was around $82,000. Today, I don't think you could hire an architect to even try to figure it out for $82,000. But they were not afraid to do their projects down there. One of the biggest things that probably supported quarries were, once they were able to get the product to the markets, and there was also an industrial revolution there. There was major population increases. The cities were growing. But one of the biggest problems in the cities is they were also burning down. So consequently, stone became the preferred building material. And this is one of the major reasons why you see so much stone in the cities, was because of the fire that was raising havoc on these close buildings, all made out of wood. And the quarries or stone grew into its own. However, some of the demise of the quarry was around in the 1890s, there was a major depression, but also during that time, they were shutting down the quarries because they had very, very strong unions then, and they couldn't come to agreements. So that was the beginning of steel, concrete, and glass. That's when you started building the cities out of different products that was more fireproof than wood, but a lot cheaper than stone. Along about 1900 was another major devastating strike at that time, and the quarries slowed down again. But the reason I mention that is, from 1887, there was 300 people lived in Stony Creek. Actually, 330 people lived in Stony Creek in 1887. By 1900, 1,395 lived there. So in 13 years, it tripled, went 6 times its population in that short period of time. And what happened was, you needed boarding houses and you needed housing. So initially the quarries had their own housing, just like Beatty's quarries had their own housing. Here in Stony Creek, they also had their own housing. And there were two boarding houses here in the Stony Creek Quarry, the Norcross Quarry. One was for the immigrants, and one was for the Englishmen. Now, as you went down, where are we? This boarding house here was for the English, and that housed about 25 men. This one here was for the immigrants, and that housed 60 men. The reason I know this one is that my grandfather and grandmother ran this one, the larger one. That was owned by the quarry. Both of them were owned by the quarry. Now, they were segregated. I think they were segregated not for segregation. I think it was mostly segregated because of custom and language was probably the biggest reason that they were segregated, because they seemed to have gotten along pretty well. But up there in the quarry housing that my grandfather owned, there was over 12 nationalities that lived in that house all at once. In fact, my grandfather one day got a visit from the sheriff, and the sheriff come up and he says, "Why aren't your kids in school?" They had 4 kids. "How come your kids aren't in school?" Never thought of sending them to school. But anyway, they were forced to go to school. My father was the oldest, and so at 10 years old, he went to first grade, along with his brother and 2 sisters. They all went to the grade together. But the interesting thing is, they could speak Swedish, they could speak Spanish, they could speak Portuguese, but they couldn't speak English. So they had, or very little English. So anyway, they overcame that, and they got along quite well. But I thought it was interesting that, of the times that they were there. One of the, as they went down through Stony Creek, you're going to go down and you'll see places that were hotels, and you're going to see places that were a lot of taverns. Now, the hotels mostly catered to a very large summer residents who came down here because they enjoyed the Stony Creek. There was 11 hotels in Stony Creek itself. But with it was also 7 taverns. And one of the biggest pastimes at the time was drinking. And the quarrymen were noted for it. And some of it out of necessity. And when I say necessity, in the quarry business in those days, it was very, very dangerous. There was crushing industries, there was falls, and there was things like that. But there was also a more sinister one, and that was silicosis, which was like a consumption. Black lung disease, it had many names. But the quarrymen, and a lot of them did this. They had to do this, or at least they felt they did. They would drink whiskey to help relieve the coughing. And sometimes they would even do it on the job. But this was how dreadful it was. And they were dying at a very young age. And one of the reasons, and I think Carl could point this out a little bit later. In fact, he has some pictures of it. Here in Norcross Quarry, the labor department came in and says, why do you have your people out in the elements? Out there, it's not good for them being out in the elements. So they closed the sheds up. And that was the beginning and the end of most of these guys. However, Beatty realized that you shouldn't do that. And he did not close his sheds up. So the incidence of silicosis was much less in the Beatty quarries than it was in the Norcross quarries. The ones that didn't survive, survived explosions and crushing industries or injuries or whatever else happened. But the interesting thing was there was no Social Security and there was no medical aid for these people whatsoever. So what it ended up, you ended up with a tight-knit community that would pitch in and help the unfortunate families that lost the breadwinner. And in those days, that's the way it was. But down there in the creek, you would almost every house had chickens, and they may have had some even a bigger one, the bigger homes would have, or bigger landholders would have cattle. And they would have the milk and chickens and eggs, and they were basically self-sustaining, but they shared this with the families. I do remember some of the men and the old-timers that end up dying from this consumption. It was a dreadful thing to see. They would be along reasonably normal, and then all of a sudden, they would start coughing, and they would cough up blood. And it was only a matter of hours before they would pass away. And it was a dreadful sight to see. But, fortunately today there's hearing protection. There was no hearing protection then. There's eye protection today, and also there's respirators for the dusty conditions. Those days they didn't have it. In fact, I'll show you something. On these derricks up here, I don't know where they are, but anyway, we have pictures of the derricks here. One of them being 135 foot high, and these men would have to climb up these things virtually daily. There's one right there. These derricks here, they would climb up these derricks daily. And when I tell you they climbed up them, that's exactly what they did. And they went up with, these staples were driven into the side of the wooden derrick, every 2 foot apart. And they would climb them up there, up these things on just these. No safety belts, no nothing else. The only thing they had was a grease can hanging off their belt. And they would go up onto the quarries with those. Also, Carl has a picture here of this derrick here was set right over here. And this was the start of the AT&T job. This was relatively modern. But I'd like to just point out the guide cables that we're all showing here. These guide cables are from one derrick. This quarry had 11 of these. 11 of these these derricks were standing. These are the steam-operated derricks. Each derrick had its own crew. Each derrick had its own hoisting engine with its own generating its own steam. It also had 8 hand derricks. It had 5 yoke of oxen, 2 locomotives, 5 miles of track. This was, at least in whatever histories I've read on this quarry, was the best equipped quarry in New England, was in this quarry. All these pictures that are here are from this quarry. Where you're sitting here right now was a rather large quarry hole, because this was a quarry face here at one time. And they eventually moved, kept quarrying back. But if you were to picture looking down to the south of us, you would see saw sheds, you would see carpenter sheds, you'd see 6 blacksmith sheds, you would see drafting shed where they designed their own. When they took a job, they took the whole job, from design to to fabrication to the erection of the structures. Many of the this here is a rough layout. In fact, it's an exact layout of how the quarry was in its day. It had its own powerhouse. It generated its own steam. It had a massive single-cylinder, horizontal, steam-driven engine that powered all the polishing machines, the drills, and whatever machines they had down in the sheds. It also was one of the first to have a dynamo in it. This quarry actually had a dynamo. And that dynamo had driven...
What's a dynamo?
It's a generator. It's a generator. And what they did was it drove the electric motors that drove what they call a swing saw. These swing saws, there was 2 of them that were here. If you can picture this, steel plates, and these things were, believe me, these things were only taken down, I'm going to say, in the last 35 years, 40 years. Prior to that, everything that you've seen on the pictures here was exactly like it was all the way into the 50s, into the 1950s, until the Castellucci's took over in 1957. They bought this quarry. But everything that was absolutely in place. These buildings looked like, when I was running around here, it was a great place to run around in those days. You had locomotives, you had derricks, you had all these things that be playing on. But if you could picture, inside the buildings, the tools were still on the workbenches, as if they went home for lunch. And it remained like that for a good 25 years. There's some people here that I know that ran around up here in those days. We used to swim in the quarry hole. In fact, a couple of them here just mentioned it, how they were swimming in the quarry holes here. The quarry hole, by the way, was right here in those days. But anyway, the buildings themselves were taken down in, I believe it was 1958. The buildings were taken down. And a lot of people to this day says, if anybody had any foresight whatsoever, they would have kept this thing as a museum. because it was probably one of the very, very few places that was so well intact from another era. But I was lucky that, I've seen it. In fact, I lived part of it. And when my great-grandfather came over here, and I believe around the 1880s, came over here, and then they, in those days, had to travel wherever the work was. So they traveled all over. He started in Beatty's Quarry. He ended up in Sachem's Head Quarry. Sachem's Head Quarry was an interesting place. It was the Hughes and Bangs Quarry. And over there in the town of Guilford, I think you had quite a history on that. But that was such a terrible, terrible place. It was called Abyssinia, because in those days it was considered the most dreadful place on earth. And that quarry was about as dreadful as you could get. And now here it is in the 1800s that a village was actually able to shut them down. This is how bad it was in those days, that they were able to shut them down. But they were in the process of building the Point Judith breakwater when they were shut down. So what happened was a lot of these people that were working in it, my great-grandfather, one of them, had to move to complete the job. And they went to the Sanderstown, Rhode Island quarries, which eventually, that's how they finished the job. But I only mention that because one of the things is they had to travel wherever the jobs were and whatever was open. This quarry, Dodd Brothers, Earl Dodd, bought this quarry right after World War I. And that's when they really had was an influx of a lot of work and some major, major jobs. And they were mostly banks and very important government buildings. Because one of the things was the architects and building owners generally specified Stony Creek granite. And one of the reasons was that it was, highly durable material. But not only that, but once it was up on the building, they used to call it eloquent. It made it appear as a very important building. So consequently, government buildings and banks like to use the Stony Creek granite. So also, they did a tremendous amount of sculpture work. This here is one of the eagles that was up on the South Station in Boston. They did this right here in this quarry, and they would ship it out. They did the Penn Central, they did Grand Central. They also owned the docks down in Stony Creek, where they would ship out the stone by water from here. It would be actually taken down in those days by oxen, and would be brought down, and that's where the bridge abutments for Brooklyn Bridge, as well as the George Washington Bridge. And they were taken out of here and brought down by water. Some of the last jobs that this quarry did, it was around in the 30s. In fact, in 1933 was the end of this quarry as a major, major quarry. They had a strike. The Quarrymen's Union, National Quarrymen's Union, which was the strongest union in the country at the time, they called a strike. And they were striking for 10 cents an hour more. And Dodd would not, as well as most of the other quarry owners, did not agree to. And so what Dodd did was locked it out. They were locked out of this quarry, and they consequently stopped as a major operation. However, it never really completely stopped. Dodd managed to hire 3 or 4 men, generally 4 men, would come up here and fulfill jobs that were either incomplete or had to replace stone that was on a project or very small projects. That's when I remember coming up here. That was in the 40s and early 50s. In fact, up on top of this rock right here, those stone up there was a derrick set up on there. And I can remember, and this was a hole there, by the way, and the trucks would back down into this hole in the quarter, and the derrick would load the blocks, some weigh 30 tons, on top of the trucks, and they would go out. And the reason I say 30 tons, those generally went out at night so they wouldn't get picked up by the police. So what would happen, I generally knew when one of those loads were coming up, and even though I was only about 10 years old then, in the early 50s, and I would sit right up there on that rock up there, and the engine house was over and back. You couldn't see the engine house, and you certainly couldn't see what the load was. So my father would put me up on top there, and my uncle, and he'd put me up on top and say, "You do exactly what I say." In other words, you're going to give the signals to my grandfather, who was running the hoisting engine up in the back. And so I would stay up there. And believe me, I thought that was a pretty important job, which I guess it was. But I would always thought, if a mosquito or something come by, what kind of signal that would get. And so even if there was one on me, I wouldn't dare move until the truck was loaded. And out they went. But anyway, I could go on a long time for this, but Carla, you have anything you would like to add to that? One of the things, though, I would like to say this. There was, and I'd like to talk about the fact of the people themselves. There were so many nationalities that were involved in this. You had an influx in the 1870s of Swedish and Italian was the main group at that particular time. In fact, a lot of them started right here. Over here in Stony Creek, the foundation is still over there for the first Swedish church that was built in Branford, was right over here in Stony Creek. So, and the point I'm making is they didn't have it easy. And there was a language barrier, there was a religious barrier, and there was the fear of economic threat. All of this proved to be for naught. These folks that came into here, just like every other nationality that came in, only thing that they were interested was making a living for their families and doing the best that they could. They were basically conservative, but they never really got to be in the political powers until many, many decades later. And then you're going to find that the Swedes and Italians and Irish and all, they ended up owning these companies, but it took a long way to get there. So it was like everything else. The hard times, the oppression, and all those things get covered over. Just like when this quarry stops, wetlands will take over here, the forests will grow over it, and the scars will be gone. And that's probably a good thing in some sense. But I do believe that, there was an opportunity missed where this piece of history, all I can show you is pictures and talk a little bit about what little bit I know about it. But I think it's so important, and I believe that all you folks, you wouldn't be here if it wasn't, to know that this area is very historic. All of this area, Guilford, Branford, Stony Creek, very, very, and we should talk about our history. Because if we don't, it's just going to end up in a trash heap somewhere, and that'll be the end of it, and it'd just be unfortunate for future generations. So anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ron. I'd like to talk a little bit about John Beatty and his Leech Island Quarry. John was brought to Canada by his parents when he was 6 years old from Scotland. And his father immediately got young John a tutor, and John put up with that for a few months, but he really didn't like school. He wanted to be a stone man like his father. But his father said no, and then he apprenticed him to a shoemaker. And that lasted about 2 weeks, and he almost tore the shop apart, and finally convinced his dad that he wanted to be a stone man. And fortunately for his father, and fortunately for a lot of people, that's what John Beatty became at a very young age. His dad, the job finished up in Nova Scotia, and they moved to Rhode Island. John's dad died when he was about 16. He had 3 siblings and a mom, and he immediately began to work to support the family. At a very young age, he started to receive government contracts for breakwaters and repairing the old stone forts that we had along the coast. But then in the 1870s, John had grown, and he had a quarry in Niantic, which he left in the hands of his brother. And he started to purchase property down in Leeds Island in what we know today as Old Quarry. If some of you live there, you're familiar with it. If some of you have gone down to the gates of the private residential area, it's one of the most exclusive residential areas anywhere along the coast of Connecticut today. But when Beatty died in 1899, he owned over 135 acres of land there. He had about 5 quarry sites on his property. Each site produced a little bit different kind of pink granite, but he was very, very successful. And as he got more and more contracts, he had, of course, to hire more workers. And the first group, as Unc has mentioned, were Swedes. Now, Guilford's population in the 1870s was less than 3,000 people. And they were all English, white, Protestant. There were a few freed blacks by that time, but they were very nervous about these Swedes being brought into their community. So the first Swedes that came had to live out on what we know today as Bear Island. It's the closest island to Old Quarry. They would row in the morning, work all day, and then row back out to the island at night. They had goats out there for milk, and in those days it became known as Goat Island. There also is a small quarry site on the island that was used in the early days. But as Beatty, again, got more and more contracts, and he built, for instance, all of the bridges along the railroad tracks from Branford to, I believe, Saybrook. That's why we have that very dangerous S-curve going from Stony Creek into Guilford, because it was built for oxen, cows, and horses, not for BMWs and and Mercedes. But by the time Beatty got the contract for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, he ended up with about 800 immigrant workers working in the quarries. They were from all over Scandinavia, all over the British Isles, Hungary, Italy, of course, all over Eastern and Western Europe. And as Unc said, they brought with them their customs, their religions, their languages. And Beatty was a very astute politician. He developed his own little community down in Old Quarry. He had a commissary. He built a Catholic chapel. The priest would come from Guilford once a week and say Mass. And with Unc's help, because his uncle told him about where it was, I found the footing for the chapel. And I found some history in the archives at the Guilford Library. It used to be known as St. Mary's Chapel, and it burned in 1922. But the footing is still there, and across the street, the Guilford Public Works just rebuilt the road. They found a natural piece of granite. It wasn't brought there, it's part of the ledge, but there's a hole in it, and somebody from Old Quarry said, don't fill that in. That used to be the baptismal font. It's right across the street from the Catholic chapel. Unc, your birth certificate was in Guilford?
Still is, I think.
Still is, yeah. My Uncle Louis, when he got drafted, he had to go to Guilford to get his birth certificate, and it had Louisa on it instead of Louis. He said, good damn it, then I don't have to go into service. They crossed it out with a pencil and put Louis, and he still had to go in for 4 years. But
the reason that is because Stony Creek was a mission of St. George. So the priests would travel to Stony Creek, and in fact, most my father and grandfathers and great grandfathers, they're all buried in Guilford, and that was the reason, was because there was a mission, and that's the reason that Carl was saying.
But Beatty was a very, very astute politician. He developed his own little community. He had his own commissary. He purchased all of his produce and meat from Guilford farmers and Guilford merchants, and they very quickly, and Stony Creek and Branford, but they very quickly realized the economic significance to having all of these foreigners living in the area. And as Unc has said, they were hardworking people. They didn't cause much trouble. They did drink a lot. We had one very famous Republican leader in Guilford who told me later in his life, when I was an adult, that he used to have to drive his father and a Mr. D'Amico from Guilford to Stony Creek Quarry to work every day on a horse and wagon. But then on the way back, they would stop at the Red House just before you go underneath the railroad into Guilford, because Guilford was dry. They were a pain in the neck back then, too. Stony Creek was wet, Branford was wet, Guilford was dry. So his father and Mr. D'Amico would have him stop at the Red House every day before they went into Guilford to have a few schnorts before they went home. Beatty had a very difficult time with the Statue of Liberty pedestal. There were a lot of union problems with the New York tugboats, etc. But all of the stone had to be cut in the Beatty Quarry, just like the West Point Monument here. They all had to be cut to specification, loaded onto several of his vessels, and then he had one or two tugs that would take them down to Hell's Gate, but they could not go from Hell's Gate to Bedloe's Island. Beatty would have to hand them over to New York tug lines because of union problems, and they would bring them to Bedloe's Island. But then sometimes they would delay unloading the stone, and Beatty wanted to get this thing done on time. He finally had to go to some of the politicians in New York and ask their help, and he did get it. But he also had problems in the quarry with sabotage. There were other companies that would send guys down to get jobs with Beatty's quarry, and then they would sabotage their work at night. Finally, Beatty hired this great big Irishman with a shotgun and a dog of unknown origin, the history says, and he would patrol at night. And then they got a second person to do the same. They lived in the quarry, but they worked at night just to protect the work that was done. In recent years, I found a memoir written by a woman whose dad worked for Beatty all his life, and she said that on the last page that all of the stone, her father told her, all of the stone for the statue's pedestal came from the quarry north of the tracks. Nobody even knew there was a quarry north of the tracks, and I went snooping around in the woods and found it very quickly. The ledge is still there. It's owned by a lovely couple, the Allens. It's a 2.5-acre site. There's steel cable laying all around, and Mr. Allen cut a piece for me. The quarry shut down in 1918, and the outside is rusty, but look at the inside of that cable. I mean, just a shiny. Mr. Allen actually has used some of this to build his barn. We had a historian from the museum at the Statue of Liberty come down about a month ago, and we took him on a tour. We're going to have geologists come out because we have pictures of the pedestal, but the letter says that the stone was picked because it was so consistently pink. And this is one sample of the stone, but there's very little black lines in it. One of the reasons Stony Creek granite is so beautiful is because it has the differentiated colors. But Beatty wanted it as pink as possible, and that's why she said in her letter that that's where the stone was from. We also recently have been given some photographs by Mr. Kirby of Branford, who's one of the really fine historians in Branford. And this is a photograph of the pedestal. They finished the pedestal. These were the last derricks on the pedestal, and this is prior to them building the steel frame that the Statue of Liberty would go on. All of this stone was pre-cut in Leeds Island, brought down to Bedloe's Island, and placed by the workers until they completed the pedestal. And then the next step was to build the frame itself, which is steel and then covered, as most of you know, with the copper sheathing that is, in fact, the statue. But all of the stone around the base comes either from the Beatty Quarry or later on the Stony Creek Quarry. Some of it, didn't they?
The Stony Creek Quarry's contribution to Bedloe's Island was the revetments around the island. You know, there's a big star-shaped thing. That was one of the very last jobs that this quarry did. It was the Commerce Building in Washington and the revetment around Bedloe's Island. The seawall around it, as well as the star-shaped structure around it. And I remember back in 1880 or 1986, 1986, that there was a big argument as to where this came from. And in fact was that I supported the fact that it did not, that it actually came from Leaks Island, and historical records show that it did come from. However, the finishing of the project, which was done in the 1930s, was done with the Stony Creek stone. And if you go there, you will see the difference in the color of the stone. The seawall and that star-shaped revetment around the statue itself are different colors. Very subtle, but it is a different color.
Beatty, as we said, was a very astute politician. During the Statue of Liberty project, he actually got the towns of Branford and Guilford to agree to a boundary change. He wanted all of his land in Guilford, so he got towns to agree to move the boundary further west. Originally, the boundary went through his living room. The house is still down there. It's called Yale Station now. It's owned by Yale. But when they moved the boundary, he even got the state legislature to approve it. You try that today. I don't think anybody's got enough money to buy that kind of a legislation. But that's one of the things that he did. Unc mentioned how dangerous the quarries were, and I just want to say that my grandfathers met each other working in the quarries for Mr. Dodd, and but my mother's father worked primarily up in Massachusetts, and this dark-haired curly guy is Anthony Perna. He was a master steam fitter, and he would be sent to Stony Creek to set up the donkey engines and the derricks. We've got pictures of him now at the end of Old Quarry Road and whatnot, but he was working on a piece of machinery in Milford, repairing a big piece of machinery, and one of the arms came down and crushed him. My grandmother was left with 7 kids, and fortunately they owned their own home up there, but as Unc said, there wasn't any real insurance or Social Security or whatever. But so many men were killed in the quarry in many different ways. My father's uncle, Anthony Cinquanta, and the family lives in Branford still. But Anthony was crushed to death by a stone when one of the ropes or cables that they were loading it onto either the ship or the car broke, and he was crushed. Men died with black powder explosions. They were hit by trains. My grandfather's sister married this little short guy, Italian, but he was a real wiseacre, and he worked in the office down here because he spoke several languages. But nobody liked him. I didn't either when I met him. But he was down there one day, standing too close to the cars as they were going around a bend, and the edge of 2 stones nipped off the end of his ear. And one of the workers, after they wrapped his head in a rag or something and sent him back in the office, he picked up the ear and nailed it to the side of the office because they didn't like him. But it was a difficult situation for these men. Fortunately for my dad, he only worked here for a short time, and then he got a job with Ball Oyster Company. The last family member to work here was my Uncle Louis, and he worked on the AT&T job with a small crew. Now, when we go up on top, and the present quarry staff, Stacy's here, she'll explain the modern day operation, but we have the buses to take you up because they'd rather you not walk. Is that right, Stace? Because kind of dangerous.
Let me. Okay. To those who would like to come up top, you're more than welcome. There is one bus today. I have made an exception to the rule. We're going to let you walk today. Everyone who is walking, I would like you to just meet me kind of over in the area by the bus. I will walk with you per the regulations of the quarry and the government. There's going to be 2 people up top, so when you get off the bus up top, you'll actually have some general direction as to where you go. 2 things. Everybody sitting on the wall, that's fine down here. Up top, it's a little different. The block up top is sharp. It's more dangerous, I guess. So I would like you all to stay on the ground, feet on the ground, same as the grade school lecture. Feet on the ground. No leaning over the edge. Up top, it's a little different. You have some height to it. No one's going to be in any dangerous position, but the stone is sharp, and I want everybody to be safe. So there is one bathroom on the site. It is behind the office trailer, so if you need to use it now. And I'll see y'all up top. Everyone says, well, what's the difference between the bottom and the top? The difference is we don't want to stand on that high wall anymore. No one really wants to hang from a derrick stick and drill the stone horizontally. So they come up here. The gentleman who I work with for, however you want to look at it, this was envisioned as a very large mountain. They took off the top layers, and when I say took off, they dug, they excavated, and they did blast. So using that technique of what we envision a crushed aggregate quarry in that back area, we still use that technique. It actually removes the upper layers. The upper layers, what you see in that back wall there, you can see right down to the face that it's stopped, is crushed. It's going to be a crushed aggregate. Because of the fragments that run throughout it, that is not something we did, that's actually the natural formation. From that level below is solid granite. That's what we use for the architecture granite, the architectural, the walls, the countertop, pavers, things of that nature. So in the 80s, they came up here, they removed the upper levels, and they started quarrying. Quarrying is done with a drill, and sometimes we use explosives. It is not necessary, but it makes our life a little easier. We take, looking into the quarry face, you would actually drill the back with a large hydraulic air-generated drill. You guys can see the one down on the bottom. It's blue. It's called the rock buggy. That was the capital investment from the new owner, Doug Anderson, who came in. I came in with him 11 years ago. He is a very responsible and involved owner, which is very nice for us. So we actually go in, we take these drills, we drill a back line, we drill a bottom line, and then we split that. So explosives. All those lines you see on all the stone here, everyone says, what are those lines? That's the drill hole. Those are the holes. The explosive we use is minimal. We want to maintain the integrity of the granite. We don't want to break it as we would up top to remove it. We would actually just split the granite. We call it opening the webbing. So then it just does a short break and it opens the webbing. That would be a primary. At that point, you would go in and you'd say, okay, there's a project coming up. They're looking for 9-foot blocks. We would quarry 6-inch on each dimension and cut it 10 feet, so to speak. 10 feet over, 10 feet over. Then you actually have a secondary cut. Those are secondaries. They're based on projects. They're cut to size for a project. Things today are done a little different. In the history, they cubed or quarried 4,000 cubic feet per month. That's a lot of granite, and there's been times when we have as well, but it's mainly based on jobs. We don't just quarry granite. It's a more responsible approach. We work with the clients and the architects. As I said before, we work with them. Battery Park is something we just finished. Battery Park is doing what's called a perimeter seat wall. 8-foot elements, 18 by 24. Not a seawall, not an ocean front, but a sitting wall around Battery Park.
Cool.
They want 8 foot, we give them 9-foot blocks. Less yield, it's more responsible, that's how we approach it. That's in the final stages. We did Federal Plaza last summer, 2 summers ago, down in New York City. This stone is prolifically used in New York City. So we just go forward with that. 34th Street is all the pavers, the sidewalks, as everyone knows them. So they just say, listen, we need more pavers, we need new curbing, there's defects or cracks or they're broken and we make more. Anybody have any questions about the beginning?
How much farther down and how long do you anticipate this for?
Okay, so geologically speaking, apparently back in the 90s they did some geological studies and test holes and things of that nature as to the depth. They believe there was 350 years left of accessible architectural granite. And when I say architectural, that means this solid mass that you would use in that line of industry. That was based on that 4,000 cubic feet per month ratio. As I said, that's not really where we stand today. It's a very different. but there is plenty of granite to be had. The depth is based on the lease. The town of Branford holds the lease here. I don't know if anyone knows that. This is a town-owned property. We are under a lease agreement with the town. Back in the early stages of what was called the Castellucci brothers, they owned a 500-acre parcel here in the quarry. They donated 450 acres to the land trust and the quarry preserve. That's where everyone sees the walking trails and whatnot around us.
Yay!
Yes, which is fun and everybody enjoys it. This 50-acre parcel, which is pretty much what you see, tree line, a little further into this tree line back to the gate, or a little beyond the gate, is the 50-acre parcel. That was written in a lease, originally a 99-year lease, to continue quarrying for projects like 34th Street, New York City, things that were already established in this granite, to continue forward, to continue producing the material in order to, whether they're restoration, additions, and things of that nature. I've lost my place, but that's okay. Your question was depth. The depth was written into the lease with the town to only go to sea level. Why, I don't know, because it would be highly unlikely that this quarry would fill with seawater. If it did, we'd all have a problem in town in Guilford and Branford. We don't even come close to this area. The front quarry, I don't even believe, goes to sea level. It's above sea level. We are probably 3 levels above the front hole. So we're not even close. That lease and that geological study for that 350 years was based on those regulations within the lease. He had said, can we only quarry projects for projects? Do we only quarry granite for projects? No, because as you can see, the granite comes out of the quarry. There's a very low yield of the solid granite, something that in your mind you would make a countertop slab. A countertop slab, or a block here at the quarry, is cut based on weights for the state of Connecticut. We can quarry an 11-foot, 6'6", 4-foot wide block. That's what we strive to do unless a project negates otherwise. That is based on Connecticut state law for weight. That's a 47,000-pound block. So that's what we go into the quarry. You can see within the formation, it's not all solid. There are what we call beds. Those horizontals that you see running throughout, we work with those beds to access the granite. It's kind of like levels in the quarry, steps, stages. We work with those, and then within those you can still see some natural. There are seams and fractures within just naturally and geologically. So you go for the 11-foot, 6'4", based on the large block, and then there are a lot of other stuff that comes out, a lot of other sizes, and those go to other projects. Are they A-quality granite? Of course they are. They're the same exact granite as the neighboring solid large piece. Those will actually go to a smaller fabricator, someone who may not have quite the size of the saws that the large block can go to. Large granite blocks are very large, very heavy, weight capacity, saw openings. You have to figure that's a very large fabricator. There's not a lot in Connecticut. Vermont has a few. We have one that was originally part of the ownership of this quarry in Rhode Island, in North Kingstown. Back in the day, the quarry, before that lease was given to the town, that 500-acre parcel was owned by Castellucci brothers. They actually owned a plant or a fabricating facility in Rhode Island. And a lot of the guys, I say a lot, the few guys that work here actually worked both in the quarry and in the winter sometimes. They would go to the plant and work in the plant. And they would saw the granite. The big blocks, they would saw them into countertops, pavers, floor tile, wall cladding, anything that could be generated at the plant. We still today work with him. We also work with smaller fabricators in Connecticut, O&G, Connecticut Stone, people like that. But they take the smaller block. They can't handle the weight capacity of those big guys that we pull out. And it's really just projects.
How many people work here? How many employees are there here?
Okay, so last year I would have said 5. So that would be Richard Atkinson, who is quarry master,
He has worked here for 32 years this year. He was trained in Finland and Italy. He is our teacher in the quarry. He is the go-to guy here. We have Daryl Pettit, who has been here 29 years, I believe, and he is our very articulate and very intelligent colleague who is now more focused on the architectural, working with the architects and the fabricators in these larger projects that we work on. Thomas Hickson, who is back, he worked back when he came out of school for Richard, and he's come back to help us because we are actually much busier than we were during my beginning here at the quarry. We've actually started to hire on a couple other people here at the quarry to assist. So right now, outside of myself, we have about 7 or 8 people, which is good for us because we're very busy. And I say this outside of just the quarrying out back. Everybody kind of takes a peek at when you're on the bottom looking out behind the quarry. The block that doesn't make architectural grade, I'm standing on one. Why is it here? Because there is something wrong with it. If it was a premium A quality, no cracks, no fractures, no imperfections in it, it would have been used for something other than a berm around the edge of the quarry. This was a hard lesson for me to learn because I used to run the payloader, and I'd go out back and I'd see this great big square and I'd pluck it out and I'd drag it out front, and Rick would say to me, "What are you doing with that?" And I'd say, "Well, it looks quite sufficient, it would work for this." He said, "Well, I put it there for a reason." And he'd get out and he'd give me the technical detail and why it was actually put out there. So what you see in that backyard, we call it the backyard, I call it the backyard, there is a lot of granite. It won't make the cut, if that makes sense. So from there, we generate wall stone, seawall, smaller walls. These could be just fine in our local water eventment. You know, we've done a lot of work recently with Sandy and Irene. When I started here, we didn't do any seawalls. Unc and his group and another gentleman in Branford, they had done 2 in like my first 5 years here. Then we had Sandy and Irene, and everybody needed a seawall. Anyone who lived on the shoreline needed a seawall. Right now, we're still involved with a lot of the finances from Sandy. We're actually going to be, right now we're working on the New Haven breakwater and the Bridgeport breakwater. So the material out back has a purpose. It is a sellable product. If it still can't make that, we crush it. How do we crush it? We hammer it. Outside of this general area that we've removed recently, that's not how we go about it here. We are here specifically for the block. That's the primary focus. This is a dimensional stone quarry. The extras that everyone likes for their driveways, sidewalks, and whatnot, we derive by hammering and crushing, and it's not an easy task, which tends to make our material very expensive. We are not a Tilcon, if that makes sense. But it's a much liked product, and it can be a much needed product. We generate some stone dust and sands and things. They work fabulous when you're putting down a patio paver for the grout lines and things. So the contractors like it. It works. It's 100% use of the material. It's responsible, as opposed to leaving. Vermont has these things that they're going through now based on their land, because there's so much granite up there that didn't make the cut, piled in mountains, miles and miles around Berry and Rock of Ages and whatnot. It's barren land. It's you couldn't build on it. It's dangerous to walk on. So we kind of make better use of the site.
Stacy, as one who has a granite driveway,
Right.
very nice. It sparkles at night. It sparkles during the day. Is that because of mica?
It is actually the quartzes that are in the granite. I don't see Dave Evans, but we work with several geologists. I will never.
It's not mica, it's feldspar, or
Yeah.
mineral cleavage bases on feldspar.
Exactly. So this is going to be a minimalist lesson in geology. Stony Creek pink, which we try not to call it because it tends to give it too much emphasis on pink. It is Stony Creek classic granite. It is pink because of the feldspars. There's 2 feldspars, plagioclase and microcline, which tends to make it more pink than other granites. There is quartz, which is the white and the grays, and then there is a biotype. Unc was talking, or Carl was saying, about the pink
at the Beatty Quarry, we have this black flow. So someone also asked me about the black inclusion up here. That's probably a biotite. It is not derivative of an iron ore. It is a mica, I believe. So the mica that's in it is black. Stony Creek granite has what we call flow structure. Any piece you see, we have black. Sometimes they run in vein or in a flow pattern, almost like waves. Sometimes we get that inclusion. That inclusion is not necessarily rejected. It is not a rejected material because the ununiformity of Stony Creek is what we like. We probably wouldn't send a slab out with that big black hunk in it just because the next guy along in the shop would say, I want that piece with that black inclusion. It's not a negative, but for us to attain it again is impossible. So we tend to have that kind of quality control if you must. A biotite inclusion like that tends to be a negative for us. It's a difficult material to quarry. It doesn't cut well. It does not burn well. We still burn in the quarry. We cut the granite with torches. When you have a thermal finish on a paver or the sidewalk, it's actually a flame that makes that rough finish. It's actually a slip resistance, or there's a coefficient of friction testing that we do. Black doesn't burn very well. So, yes.
In the paper recently, they were talking about a 9/11 memorial that the writing is fading off of. Why? I mean, the stuff is very solid, but why does it fade out like that?
Okay. I'm surprised you brought that up, but I'm good with that. I actually went. So I went this morning actually at my house, and I went in and I read the article that we talked about with a geologist. There was an article in, I believe, the Boston Globe that was said to have the Stony Creek granite black flow structure was growing. It was becoming more black. So we kind of chuckled to ourselves in the quarry and thought, that's funny, the base of the Statue of Liberty, South Station, Grand Central, none of our black grows. It seems kind of magical and mystical in theory. It won't grow. It can't become more. It is a 300 million year old stone. It's basically set in stone, the geological makeup. Unless magically, or however you want to look at it, it would grow or get more black is absurd. The stone does change in some way, shape, or form color. The seam that you see, these are seams, or we call them headers. They've been exposed to millions of years. They've been open cracks or fissures in the stone. They have a different color, but they're not changing, so to speak. That's just environment. That's just rain and bird droppings and soils and things that have gone into the cracks in the granite. But as far as change, I'd be hard pressed to believe that. We don't have iron ore in our stone. There's no iron minerals, so we don't rust. There was another thing that somebody had purchased, some granite, and it started to rust. Well, they had chosen, somebody had chosen a alternate material, called it Stony Creek, and it rusted in the wall application. It had iron in it, and we don't. We hold very dear the specs that an architect writes. He wants Stony Creek. There's a reason. Whatever his reason is, it's important to uphold the spec. That's something that Daryl Pettit is constantly working on, maintaining a spec, making sure that the architects and the installers and the masons follow through with the original intent to work with the stone. And there's reasons, whether it be this ASTMs, which are standards in the industry, as to why you chose it. We're the base course of the Statue of Liberty. We are the base course of a lot of buildings. There's a reason. It's structurally sound.
What's your pricing? How do you determine price on stone?
Price on stone is, actually it's pretty straightforward. Up top it's $26.50 per cubic foot for granite. But there's a lot of factors involved in that. That's buying a block. That's not cut to your size. That's an 11 foot, 6 foot, 4 foot. Anything under that for smaller, which is naturally derived. In other words, we went in for the 11 foot, we ended up with a couple 3-footers on the height. Anything under 4 foot on the height, it's $23.50. If I have to take the $26.50 block and cut it in half for you, it's more. It doesn't make sense. This is one of the arguments here is, how come if it's smaller it costs more? Well, because it came out of a quarry in this state
and now you want a piece that's yay big. From there, the material out back is really priced by ton, per ton. We don't only sell to the industry. It's not, we are a retail wholesale. We work with clients. If you said, I want a countertop, I'm not a countertop person, but I can assist. We assist our clients and our customers. We have everything from, a seawall gentleman who's been here recently to do something large like the New Haven breakwater. We did a project last summer in Long Island. Large, 20-ton boulders, one per truck. The seawall material that's leaving now, only 5 stones in a truck. Doesn't seem to make sense, but we are one of the only quarries. Everyone else is an aggregate quarry, locally for the most part. They have what they call oversized, but not to the extent that we have oversized. And when we have oversized, boy, do we have oversized. It's hard actually to find a 2 to 5 ton. It's not hard, I shouldn't say that. But we have a lot of 20-tonners that we push around to get to the smaller. Your average human or average contractor doesn't work with what we do. We lose perspective quite quickly here. Yeah. You asked on the way up. On our way up, we saw several large, kind of fun-looking pieces. Those are Daryl Petting. He's our resident sculptor. Daryl works on a very grand scale because he has access to our equipment and being here. There is a class, there's a couple guys here from the class that is taught over in Guilford at the Art Center for stone sculpting and whatnot. They can come here and purchase granite. We do work with artists. Daryl is, as I said, the resident sculptor, so a lot of his pieces, he's had them up at the KISS. The KISS went up to Storm King in New York. He's also the gentleman who worked on the piece Stonehenge, it's a Circle of Life over in Guilford, off of Old Quarry. He's exactly, the beautiful piece at the harbor. He's a very talented stone sculptor. Like I said, he gets use of, he sees a grand piece and he says, can you bring that down for me? And we bring the big payloader up and we bring it down. So he's quite lucky. But if you were thinking of doing something, you're always welcome to come. It's accessible, and it's something we're pleased to work with.
Can you go back to the history when it was a mountain? How high a mountain?
Okay. It's quite simple. From this peak here, where you can kind of see the rubble on the edge here, this actually just rose only as high as that face there. That's it, and it ran over through here. The property again goes back quite a ways further under the lease line. This granite formation actually runs coming down Leeds Island Road, Thimble Island Road? Leeds Island Road. So all the way from 95, this granite formation runs all the way back to 95, but not within the lease line. The stone exists, we don't have access to it. We wouldn't need it, just based on the parcel we have here, there's no reason to go beyond. Beyond this actual high wall here, over on the other side of that power line, there's no granite. This is a bubble, basically. As it runs out and away from the center core, the material becomes fragmented. You can see it in the outskirts, in the upper levels. It's very fragmented. That's natural. That's nothing we did. That's how it's formed. So we remove that. And then from, say, the level we're standing on, below is the solid granite. That's where we start quarrying. Quarrying's a slow technique as well. It's not that, we don't derive a lot of material real quick. It takes about a month to do a large formation, but enough to satisfy all our customers. We're doing really well thus far. Yeah.
What are the iron rods behind you here?
Those are actually drill steel. Those are what we use to drill the granite, and they're in there for burials. You can see them right along. And sometimes they get stuck, so some of these I bet are stuck. You get in trouble when you stick a drill steel in a stone. When you run the drill that's down there, that rock buggy, it's usually just a 10-foot drill steel, so at the bottom there's a carbide bit at the bottom. They're knockoffs, so you can only usually do about 3 holes at a time. You pull the drill steel out, you knock off the bit, you put a new one on. They're sharpened, but you can get them stuck. You can also get in trouble for sticking, because it's not something you can go back and just pull out. It's there forever, unless you can split a little bit further along. I want to read a couple things that we've been doing, because it's fun. It's fun for me. Some of the Battery Park obviously has been one of our larger projects. Federal Plaza, the Jacob Javits Federal Plaza down in New York City.
was something we just did with the Stony Creek. We just finished Quinnipiac University. They redid the medical facility over where they took those two Anthem buildings in North Haven. They had joined them with the entire facade of that building is Stony Creek, all the pavers, wall, everything. Right now I'm working specifically on Connecticut College. They actually were using a material out of, it's called Milford Pink, it's out of Rhode Island. But they were able to change the spec, in other words, to use a Connecticut local stone, their stone, Connecticut stone. So they're going to use that. Naugatuck Valley. So much is used, kind of like Unc was saying, the whole integrity of the material and, you know, its uniqueness. Federal, medical, academics, that tends to be our main clientele outside of homeowners and residents. The Brooklyn Bridge Park Pier, we're doing something there. We just finished a beautiful, actually we're in the stages of finishing with Stony Creek. We aren't doing the projects. We are selling the material. We sell to a client. We sell to an architect. We might sell to a fabricator who has used us before. They purchase the raw granite. We are not making claim to making or producing. St. Mary's Church in New Haven, a beautiful church over within the Yale district. They're redoing all the pavers in front. And it's fun because there's only one very small rock face, which is that very natural look. Right across the center of this beautiful grand church, right across the center there's a strip of Stony Creek. So to have the whole front paver, the whole entire 9,000 square feet across the front of this church is now Stony Creek. It's a beautiful project. A small project, some posts I'm working on with a fabricator to do some Smithsonian posts, where you would have posts at the Smithsonian with that wrought iron across the top. You know, they go from large to small. Nothing is too large, nothing is too small.
The surface, how did you get it smooth?
It actually splits naturally smooth on those horizontals. Those are actually natural cracks or fractures within the formation, and we work with them. They work very well. They're all about 15 feet high. So we actually drill down to what we call a bed. You'll see some on the top of the piece that's being cut down there. It kind of looks like it sloped off. It did. It ran right down from the front all the way to the bottom and towards us. Those beds or those naturals are smooth. They don't need to be split, drilled, or anything.
You can get a vertical smooth over here.
That's smooth. You're talking this vertical smooth?
Yeah.
That's a torch. We actually still cut the granite with a torch. So I explained the drilling on the back. You drill on the bottom, and we actually cut what's called a channel burn. We burn a torch which runs about 4,800 degrees. It's on a chamber. It's over in the corner. It's very loud. There's a lot of safety implements we have to use it. It actually cuts the granite. You'll see some of the pieces down in front of our office. A gentleman out of Massachusetts, he carves with a torch. You can actually cut the granite. Because it is a granite and it came from, I want to say flame or molten, it will actually cut with a torch. So we cut that. Actually, that's a channel burn. So you would actually channel burn both ends. So drill, channel burn, use a small explosive, open the webbing, that's your big primary. Normally about 60 feet.
How far down does the torch go?
What's that?
The torch, you can put the torch in the drill holes?
On a mast, the mast is about, I want to say, 15 feet. And it runs up and down the mast, and it actually runs on a track. So then there's a small motor, actually walks it back. So it actually just goes up and down, and then it walks back, so it cuts that channel burn within the formation. Yeah, it's loud and noisy. Yeah, but we still use it. We're actually working towards what's called a wire saw. It's a diamond impregnated wire that actually cuts the granite. It's easier, it's more user friendly. It's just a matter of whom are we purchasing it from. Thank you. It's an open door policy. Come, call. I have cards if anyone's interested. There's a website. I'm in the book. Don't go to the yellow pages because it's wrong. It gives you the facts. Don't call my fax machine if you can't get a hold of me. Just drive here. There's a phone in the office. Call me when you get here.